welcome back for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast. We have a very special guest for you today. We're very excited about. Anybody who reads about naval history will recognize this modern-day naval history classic, Shattered Sword, the untold story of the Battle of Midway. Co-author of this acclaimed work, Jonathan Parshall, is back with us today, and he's back in the magazine in the July-August issue, which we're thrilled to have him in there for. And in this article, he talks about the two crucial months between the victory at Midway and the launch of the Guadalcanal campaign, and how during that time frame, Admiral Ernest King seized the initiative and altered the strategic calculus of World War II. So here to talk to us about From Midway to Watchtower is our good friend Jonathan Parshall. John, welcome back. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's our pleasure, and it's our pleasure to have this article in the magazine too. It's getting great feedback.
Cool.
So I sort of set the general premise for it there, but why don't you talk viewers through what happened in those two pivotal months in the summer of 42?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, I became interested in this because I was looking at some of the entries in what's known as the Gray Book, which is the running intelligence summary that was kept by Pac Fleet in Hawaii. So this is Admiral Nimitz's crew. And it has all of the message traffic going back and forth between Nimitz and his boss, Ernest King, and the various subsidiary commands. And the thing that I was sort of struck by was in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Midway. I mean, the waves have barely calmed over that battle, which ended on June 7th. Just 3 days later, the teletypes start chattering, and a communique comes off from Admiral King, who is Nimitz's boss. And he's basically laying out, okay, I think this is what the Japanese are going to be doing next. And he very wisely assesses that I think the Japanese are going to try to hit us in the south and make our life difficult in terms of keeping Australia in supply. There's, of course, the supply line that runs from the west coast down to Australia and goes through places like Fiji and Samoa and Tonga and stuff like that. And so he immediately starts telling Nimitz, get ready, because we may be doing operations in the South Pacific here in very short order. And throughout the month of June then becomes more and more concerned, because we're also starting to get intelligence reports from the Solomon Islands that the Japanese have landed a group of construction troops on this heretofore unknown island called Guadalcanal. And we don't know what they're doing, but there sure is a lot of kunai grass being burnt over on Lunga Point. And it's not going to be until July the 7th or the 6th actually, that we're going to have positive identification that the Japanese are building an airfield on this island. But even before that happens, on like the 22nd of June, King is already telling Nimitz, get ready, we're going to go. And we're going to take the one amphibious capable division that we have in the theater, which is the 1st Marine Division, which isn't even fully constituted at this point. It's got 2 regiments, but we've got the parachute battalion and the raider battalion and some odds and ends. So we've got basically a division that we can play with here. We're going to take that puppy and we are going to land in the Solomon Islands at Tulagi, which is the provincial capital. It's just north of Guadalcanal, across what is going to be called Iron Bottom Sound here in a few months. We're going to land in Tulagi and adjacent positions, and we are going to take back this particular chunk of the Solomon Islands. The reason that he is so concerned about that is that if you look at a map, you can see the Solomons kind of stretch down. I'm trying to do this in reverse. They stretch down from the island of New Britain, where the Japanese have a very large base called at Rabaul. And so the Solomons come down to the southeast, and they're pointed basically at New Caledonia, Fiji, and Tonga, which, again, these supply lines that the Allies have to Australia are running through. And if the Japanese can get an airbase up and running in Guadalcanal, they will put the rest of the Solomon Islands under their air umbrella, and that would then serve as a launch pad for further operations that would be aimed at those Allied bases down in Fiji and Samoa. And so King is aggressive, and he says, the easiest way to forestall that is not to sit back on the defensive, but to go ahead and actually take away that launching pad from the Japanese. He's got a number of problems, though, in terms of actually making this happen. The first is that Guadalcanal, technically speaking, is in Douglas MacArthur's command area. So there are two theater commanders in the Pacific at this point. We got Nimitz, who is in charge of the North, Central, and Southern Pacific operational areas. And then we got Douglas MacArthur, who's in Australia at this point, and he is running the Southwest Pacific area. And if you look at a map, the 160-degree meridian goes right through the middle of Guadalcanal. It's like 2 miles to the west of Lunga Point, where Henderson Field is eventually going to be. And so when MacArthur finds out that that King is contemplating an amphibious assault in his command area, he understandably kind of goes ballistic and says that this is a insidious plot on the part of the Navy to try to take over command of all the Pacific strategy making and blah, 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 blah. King very much sticks to his guns. He's like, I've got the only amphibious capable division in the theater. My division, my ships are going to have to keep it in supply. Therefore, my operation, sorry, not sorry. And it eventually takes George Marshall, who is MacArthur's boss, to come in and kind of broker a peace deal and say, okay, look, we're going to let the Navy run this operation in Guadalcanal, but any further operations up the Solomons will be under your control, Doug. It's all good. And so what they end up doing is they actually kind of gerrymander the command map. They shove the dividing line for the Southwest Pacific area and the South Pacific area over 1 degree to the west, so that now Guadalcanal falls within Nimitz's command area. The other thing that King has got to contend with is the British, because when this war kicked off, of course, everybody adhered to the principle of Germany first, because Germany is by far the biggest, most important of the Axis coalition, and we need to hamper its war-making ability as rapidly as possible, because, if the Germans get topside on the Soviets, for instance, eventually trying to do an invasion of the European continent is going to be very, very difficult. And so the British view Germany first as an article of strategic faith, and everyone needs to adhere to that. And here King is coming in and saying, well, yeah, but I'm going to be running some offensive operations in the Pacific here in the very near future. This all comes to a head in July, because during this entire time frame, General Marshall has been agitating with the British that I want to do a landing in Europe either in late 1942 or early 1943 at the earliest. And in early July, he gets wind of the fact that the British, who have been kind of stringing him along, honestly, oh, yeah, we could maybe do that, are definitively not in favor of that sort of an operation. And so he goes over to Britain with King in late July, and he's going to hammer out a deal with the British as to what they are going to be doing in Europe for the rest of 1942. The problem for King and Marshall is that FDR hauls them aside and lets them know in no uncertain terms, you have to come home from this meeting with a deal. And that deal has to have American troops in combat somewhere against the Germans by the end of this year. That is non-negotiable. I don't care where that combat is happening, but we have to be shooting at the Germans. Go. The British, it seems like, may have gotten wind of the fact that Marshall and King now have these negotiating handcuffs on them. And so the British understand that as long as they just hold the line and say, no, we're not going to Europe, no, we're not going to Europe, no, we're not going to Europe, they're going to win this debate. And they do. So at the end of this series of meetings, which run from July the 20th to July the 23rd, 1942, the British just basically sit there and twiddle their thumbs and break pencils and what have you. And eventually, Marshall has to concede defeat. And what ends up happening in that meeting is they say, okay, we're not going to go into Europe. We're going to go into North Africa instead, which the Americans hate. And a lot of the British chiefs are not super thrilled about either. But that is sort of the compromise that gets thrown out here. And that is what Marshall and King are going to take home to FDR at the end of July and say, okay, we're going to be shooting at the Germans in North Africa instead. But there's a proviso that's buried in sort of the memoranda that comes out of this meeting. And at the bottom of it, it says that, gee whiz, we've got 700 or so aircraft, American aircraft, that were slated for use in a European invasion that we were going to be bringing over to Britain. But now that that's off the table, gee whiz, we're going to use them wherever we want to, which is going to be the Pacific. And a lot of those aircraft are going to be ending up in the Guadalcanal campaign. And so what this gives King, in essence, is, he's now got official paper that says, I can wage offensive activities in the Pacific, which heretofore had been kind of anathema. Germany first means we're going to stand on the defensive in the Pacific and we're not going to do anything there. But now King has got a document that says, well, no, actually, I can go ahead and do this. And it's kind of funny because fast forward to early August, you're going to have Sir John Dill, who is the main British liaison in Washington, D.C. He's sort of the representative for the British chiefs on the combined chiefs of staff, which is based in D.C. He's going to be coming into the office of guys like Marshall and saying, it seems like you guys are no longer, really viewing Germany first as being the Holy Bible. And Marshall's kind of like, yeah, because we're not. What King has done in the course of these meetings he walked in on July 20th with Germany first as Holy Writ. He walked out on July 23rd, and now that's been modified to be Germany mostly first. And what you're going to see happening here is that there are going to be high-intensity combat operations in the Pacific for the remainder of this war. And that is all due to Ernest King stepping in aggressively and saying, the battle at Midway, dropped this enormous windfall in my lap. How am I going to use it? And capitalizing on that ruthlessly and aggressively to say, we are going to go and we are going to start rolling the Japanese back. Because if you look at the scale of the Japanese conquests in the early part of this war, they are enormous. And King understands we can't just sit pat on the defensive here for the next 3 or 4 years and then start to roll the Japanese back. It just doesn't make any sense. We got to get busy now. So this 2-month time period, I think, is absolutely crucial to strategy making within the war, in that Ernie King rapidly reorients all of American naval strategy towards a new counteroffensive in a theater that no one could have found on a map 6 months ago, practically. And in the process of not only kicking that operation off, also alters Anglo-American grand strategy away from Germany first to this sort of Germany mostly first vision. That's a tremendous accomplishment if you look at that. And so that's why I wanted to write the article. It was so impressive watching how King was able to orchestrate all of that within this very compressed time frame. Because on August 7th, which is going to be tomorrow when we're recording this thing, the invasion of Guadalcanal kicks off.
It's fascinating. The strategy of working with your allies, as much as the strategy of fighting the war,
yeah,
layers of strategy. This inspires a very interesting counterfactual. I was thinking of it as you're talking.
Yeah.
All the American commanders, I know Ike was big on this, they wanted to invade Europe.
Yeah.
They wanted to get to Europe. The British held back on that. What if the British had caved and said, okay, we'll go to Europe in late 42? That would have robbed King of his slide this little codicil in at the end, because the aircraft would have been earmarked. It changes the entire trajectory of the Pacific War, would it not?
No, I think that's right. I will say, as an aside, there was no possibility of that counterfactual actually happening.
Most of them there aren't.
but no, good point. Because had that been actually okayed, there would have been even more of an emphasis to hurry up and get as much materiel into Britain as possible for this invasion. The the problem from the British standpoint is, the American army hasn't really demonstrated that it has taken the number of the Wehrmacht. I mean, there's no credible evidence that suggests that the Americans can go toe to toe with the Germans and actually win on the ground. The British at this point have been kicked off the continent, how many times? At least three. They were kicked out of France. They've been kicked out of Norway. They were kicked out of Greece when they tried to help down there. So the British at this point are really grappling with the sense that the British army doesn't seem to be good enough to deal with the Germans. I mean, they've been getting their butts consistently kicked by Rommel in the northern desert. And the British are very much aware at this point that they are the weakest of the great powers in terms of manpower, that they can't afford to squander another army, because if they lose an army, there's no replacement army for it. America is in a much different position, with 140 million people under its belt. They can put large armies in the field if need be. The British can't do that. So the British are going to play a much more conservative game than the Americans are. And that's going to be a constant, source of tension up until 1944.
The other thing that's interesting about King's move is that he's also upended the pre-war planning playbook for the Pacific, the Navy's pre-war planning. Let's talk about that.
Sir. Yeah. So for decades, War Plan Orange had envisioned there was going to be a methodical advance across the Central Pacific through the Marshall Islands and then eventually into the Marianas, with the goal being that we're going to relieve the Philippines eventually, which was an American territory at the time. So, yeah, this is shockingly unorthodox on the part of King. He's basically throwing out 25 years worth of naval orthodoxy, and he's saying, no, we're actually going to fight down in this backwater, down in the Solomons, at the extreme end of our supply lines. And I'm betting that my Navy is going to do a better job of logistics and adaptation to a new theater of operations than the Navy of my enemy, which is really bold when you think about just how successful the Japanese Navy has been up to this point in this war. But yeah, he ends up, sort of yanking the focus of naval combat 2,500 nautical miles down to the south, and it's going to be in the Solomons now for the next year and a half.
Mm-hmm. And I think you point out that it ends up being the most consequential campaign of the Pacific War, arguably.
I would argue that, yeah. Which is ironic for a guy who wrote a book on the Battle of Midway, right? Everybody always looks at Midway, the turning point. And Midway is the most important single naval battle of World War II. But it's not because it ends the war overnight. It's because of the emergent possibilities that it creates for King to counterattack someplace else. One of the things I talk about in this book that I'm working on 1942 is what I call the need for a sausage grinder. That if you look at the first 6 months of the Pacific War, they are relatively episodic in nature for the Americans. Which is good for us because we were completely unprepared for this war and very disorganized and blah, blah, blah. But, we fought a ground campaign for 4 months in the Philippines that has now ended in disaster, with the Bataan Death March and all that stuff. There's no ground combat going on anymore for us. We've done some carrier raids around the perimeter in places like the Marshall Islands and whatnot. But there's no place in the Pacific in June of 1942 where we are in constant daily contact with the Japanese. And that's now becoming a bad thing because if you look at Japan, yes, they are much weaker long-term than America, but they are still a modern industrialized nation state. And the only way of beating that sort of a country is to apply cumulative levels of attrition to their military, just grind it to pieces, so that we eventually can place our forces in a place like the Marianas, where we can either bomb Japan to ruins, blockade it into submission, or invade it. That's how this war has got to end. And so we need to stoke up the attritional engine here somewhere. It doesn't even really matter where. But every morning I want to Well, I want to know when I'm rolling out of bed that I'm going to be killing Japanese soldiers, shooting down their aircraft, and hopefully getting into a naval battle on a pretty frequent basis, because that's how we've got to get this war over with. And so, what Midway gives us is the ability to set up that sausage grinder in the Solomons and do it months earlier than we otherwise might have been able to. It shortens the war. Because, yeah, the Solomons as a whole, the struggle for Guadalcanal is going to run until February of 43. And in the course of that battle, the Japanese are going to lose something on the order of 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen killed, 800 to 900 aircraft shot down, 25 major warships. It's far more consequential than what happened at Midway alone. So, yeah, I would argue very strongly that Guadalcanal and the Solomons campaign as a whole is the most important campaign of the Pacific War.
It's funny that that's the outcome of it, but at the start, as you say, it was an obscure little dot on the map that wasn't even on anyone's radar.
Yeah.
Let's talk. This is kind of a little bit of a segue, but it's talking about 1942, and we're going to talk about your upcoming book, which you're very excited about. The sort of consolation prize for the Anglo-American alliance was the Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. What do you think of that? I've never really talked to you about that.
I feel like that was the least bad option that was available to us. The Americans hated it, to start with, because they looked at it as a diversion. Understand that American strategy as a whole, in terms of winning the war against Germany, was about as subtle as a broadsword through the chest, right? I mean, the way we're going to win this war from the American perspective is we're going to land an incredibly powerful army in Northern Europe. We are going to destroy the Wehrmacht. We are going to drive through the Ruhr and destroy their industrial base. And we're going to just, that's it. That's how the Reich is going down. And that is going to be the right answer in 1944. It is not the right answer in 1942. The U.S. Army had to learn its craft. We had to come to grips with the Wehrmacht. And everybody's first encounter with the Wehrmacht is a bad encounter, because they're really good at making war. And that's going to become painfully obvious even in 42 at places like Long Stop Hill, and even more so, of course, at Kasserine Pass and that kind of thing in early 43. So until the U.S. Army has really sort of paid its freight on the learning curve, going into Northern Europe and trying to do that learning in France, that's a bad idea. I think Rick Atkinson is absolutely right on the money when he says in one of his books that North Africa was a good place to be lousy in. Northern Europe would have been a bad place to be lousy in, because we just had a lot of learning that we had to do. And not only on the ground, also in the air. If you look at the air command arrangements in North Africa to start with, they're totally botched. You've got two separate air forces, the Americans and the British, and they're not coordinated, and we can't do ground support with beans. And, so there's just a lot of learning about not only how do the Americans fight the Germans, but how do you run a joint army, British-American army? How does this whole joint command thing going to work in the field? There's a lot of stuff that comes out of that that's going to pay dividends in Europe later on in 44 as well. So, yeah, overall, I think Torch was the best play we could have made at that point.
Right, and I think Rick Atkinson's first book in that trilogy is very artfully titled "An Army at Dawn," which speaks to what you're saying here.
Absolutely.
No, well, let's talk about your forthcoming book, because I'm very interested to hear more about it. It's called 1942: Crux of War.
Crux of War. That's right.
And it'll be out next spring.
Yep.
So maybe you could give us a sort of preview of that and how it ties in with your article in the current issue of the magazine.
Yeah. So I became interested in the structure of 1942 really just a couple of years after Shattered Sword was out, which, Shattered Sword came out in 2005. I have been working on this 1942 book now for the past 16 years. Granted, I had a day job up until 4 years ago, and so this was kind of my part-time project. But I'm just really interested in how the entirety of that year went down. And I felt that in 2007, I didn't really have a good understanding of the year and I wanted to make myself smarter. So that really was the genesis of the project. I think that one of the things that I've sort of encountered is that in the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a rise of what I would call Eastern Front determinism, which is to say that with the failure of Operation Barbarossa in summer or fall of 1941, pick your date depending on the scholar that you're reading, that a lot of people will say, well, the war is over. The Germans can't beat the Russians anymore. This is the biggest theater in the war. And therefore, this thing is in the bag for the Allies. And I look at that, I'm like, that's ludicrous because you're basically saying that the war is over before the Japanese and the Americans are even in the broader conflict. First of all, I just find that absurd. Second, I feel that with all due respect to the scholarship of a number of these people who are friends of mine, this is Robert Citino, David Stahel, Evan Maudsley. I know all these guys. They're all friends. I really respect them. However, I think that a lot of those analyses look at mostly the military facets of what's going on the Eastern Front and neglect a lot of the economic facets. Because the truth of the matter is the Soviet economy in 1942, absolutely the wheels could have fallen off of that thing. People were starving. Uh, their GDP is now below that of Germany. They've lost all of their or half of their aluminum production, 60% of their steel production. I mean, it's just their economy is on a knife's edge at this point. And it could have fallen apart. And in fact, I think it very nearly did fall apart in the summer of 1942. It's interesting, if you look at Stalin's order number 227 that he issues in the middle of Operation Blau, the summer offensive, which is the famous not a step back order. Anybody who abandons their positions can be shot on the spot. If you read the actual text of that order, it is framed almost strictly in economic terms that, the Soviet Union is not a desert, that, all of this territory that you, the Red Army, are giving up is full of farms and wheat for bread and factories and metal and blah 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 blah. I mean, he's not being terribly subtle about this. He uses the word bread something like 7 different times in that order. Okay, so what I'm basically saying is that the Eastern Front is by no means concluded until the end of 1942, and that more broadly, then you not only need to look at what's going on the Eastern Front, but you have to understand all the linkages that are occurring between the other theaters in the war as well. China is incredibly important during this year, and yet we hardly think of them now, 80 years in arrears. But if you look at a lot of the communiques that are going back and forth between Churchill and FDR and so forth, they're very concerned about China. China has to stay in this war because China is acting as a sump for Japanese troops that might otherwise be causing trouble for the Soviets in Manchuria. And the last thing that Stalin needs at this point in this war is another active war on a completely different front. And so keeping China in the war is essential to keeping the Soviet Union in the war as far as our leadership is concerned. So again, there's a lot of interconnection here. And so I wanted to explore the totality that is the war rather than just focusing on one specific theater.
That sounds great. So you singled out 1942 as a kind of, as you say, the crux of war, the crux
Yeah.
of this war, sort of the pivot point, the hinge, whatever words you
Yep.
want to use. Um, I'm trying to grapple with a way to word this. So 1942 was such a pivotal year. What about 1943, 1944? How would you encapsulate them
Sure.
in sort of reference to 42?
Yeah, if you look at 43, it's a year of frustration, I would say, from the Allied standpoint. I mean, take a look at the Pacific. We chew our way a few hundred miles up the Solomon Islands and a few hundred miles up the coastline of New Guinea. Big whoopee. If we keep going at that rate, we're not going to make it to Tokyo until 1960. And there are a lot of people that are very cognizant of that fact. You look at what happens on the Eastern Front. Yes, the Soviets win at Kursk, but the battle lines are not changing that dramatically. The strategic bombing offensive that is now being carried out by both the British and the Americans, that's really tough sledding in 43. But what's happening kind of behind the scenes is there's a tremendous correlation, a change in the correlation of overall forces, I would say. And the American industrial machine really gets stoked up in that year. And what I think is sort of happening is that we're setting the stage for being able to just blow the doors off this thing in 44. And that's really what ends up happening. So it's funny because the book I'm writing now, the 42 book, is set up in such a fashion that, if I wanted to, I could do a similar treatment of 43 and 44. I don't think I would want to, though, because 43 is just such a headbanger. Do you really want to go through that whole year?
But you
And
could fast forward to do 44, right? That's the next big
good.
eventful year, right?
Yeah, and it is super important. You look at something like the fact that the Americans are able to carry off an invasion of the European continent and the Marianas Islands within about 10 days of each other. Holy cow. I mean, talk about, emergent superpower. No one has ever been able to do something like that in the course of human history. It's really astonishing. But the problem for me is that a lot of what I'm doing in this 42 book is talking about what's going on under the hood, if you will. It's not just this happened, then this happened, then this happened kind of treatment. I really want to understand the transformation of the Allied militaries during this year. And as a result, I'm doing a lot of kind of bigger picture stuff. What's going on under the hood? Why are these things changing? What led to this transformation? So this is sort of John Parshall's unified field theory of why the Allies won the war. And so a lot of the things that I'm talking about here in 42, I would just have to say again in 1944. We've talked about why is our aircraft production so much more efficient than the Germans? Well, I already talked about that in 42. Do I want to do that again in 44? I don't know. Because back to the 42 thing. If you look at the beginning of this year, it's a dumpster fire for the Allies. It's just,
Right.
oh my, it's so bad
Yeah.
everywhere. We're just getting our heinies kicked.
No good news from any quarter. Right.
No. And Richard Overy makes this comment in the beginning of his book, Why the Allies Won, which is brilliant. He says, for any rational person on the street at the beginning of 1942, they never would have guessed that the war was going to end the way that it ended. It was not at all apparent that things were going to go the way they went. Fast forward to the end of 42. There's about a 40-day time period here, which is the most ruinous for Axis fortunes, I think, during the entirety of the war. On October 23rd, the Brits kick off the Battle of Alamein, which is going to crush Rommel. A week or so later, 2 weeks later, we land in North Africa, in Algeria and Morocco. And that is now essentially kicking in the back door against Rommel, and is also directly imperiling the Italians, and they know it. The Americans arguably on November 14th, 15th, are going to win the second naval battle of Guadalcanal, which I would argue essentially seals that campaign. We are going to win that campaign. And just 3 days later, the Soviets kick off Operation Uranus, which is going to end up encircling all of the German forces at Stalingrad. And a lot of people don't take this into account. Not only does it end up encircling all of 6th Army, most of 4th Panzer, but destroys the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, and eventually is going to destroy the Hungarian 1st Army and the Italian 8th Army. So there are 6 Axis armies that go down in the drink at the end of that campaign. How did all that happen? That's really what I'm looking at this book, because there's a tremendous amount of stuff going on behind the scenes, like the transformation of the Red Army. It's not like the Red Army just rolled out of bed one morning and said, we're not going to get our butts kicked by these guys anymore. There has to be this complete reorganizing of their military structure. They got to put different weapons in different levels of the table of organization. They got to do new doctrine. They tear their org chart up not once but twice in the course of 15 months, all while you're doing a fighting retreat against the most powerful army in the planet. So there's just a lot going on here from a doctrinal and organizational standpoint, not only in the Red Army but in the Allied armies as a whole. That's what leads to what I would say, a better parity in terms of these militaries. We now can at least perform comparably with the Axis militaries, and that's tremendously important.
Indeed. Yes, it does sound like to really understand this war, you need to understand what's going on behind the scenes in 1942. And that brings up something I often grapple with and think about and try to express to folks who are trying to get their heads around history. You can never quite get it like it felt to be on the ground there, unless you were there.
Yeah.
We can't help but read World War II narratives and know how it's going to turn out.
Right.
If you're alive in 42, in early 42, it doesn't look at all like it looks to us, and we're looking at that same time period. They see a world of great uncertainty and peril. Whereas we know that the story is going to get better as the story goes on. That's one of the sort of shortcomings of trying to get your head around historical events, I think. You can't really see what it felt like on the ground yourself unless you were there.
Eisenhower has this beautiful quote where he, in his history of the war that he wrote, he's like, not even the most sincere and analytical of us can recall the fears and worries of that time. So, even a guy like Eisenhower, who's got access to really good information, he had no idea how this thing was going to turn out. And he is very much saying that this was a very scary time. The diary of Alan Brooke, the head of the British Chiefs of Staff, likewise, after a particularly bad run of events in 1942, he confesses to his diary that I have had for the first time the feeling that we are going to lose this war unless we control it very differently. It is all desperately depressing. So that's what, even the guys in the top end with pretty good crystal balls, things are looking bleak in, February, March, April in 1942. It's terrible. So.
And that reversal of fortune by the end of the year is a miraculous story. And it sounds like you're going to go into that in exhaustive detail. And
fairly exhaustive. Too many words.
I mean that in a good way. I don't mean that in a
appreciate it.
I mean that in a good way. I'm dying to see this book. So I hope you'll keep us in the loop when it's about to hit the stands. We'll very much get hold of a copy of it. And I hope you'll maybe grace the pages of the magazine again.
Would love to.
With that, if you'd like to. We'll be here, and that book's going to have a lot of anticipation for it, I think, and can't wait to see it. It's called 1942, Crux of War. Jonathan Parshall is the author. This should be a real magnum opus follow-up to Shattered Sword. Congratulations. You must be on the home stretch by now. I'm sure there's still a lot of work left, but we're in the home stretch, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm actually literally laying the book out even as we speak. I'm working on the December chapter right now. Yeah.
We're going to let you get to that.
I'm slinging InDesign. I'm kind of a weirdo in terms of historians, in that I do have a pretty good package of graphical skills as well. And so I actually laid out Shattered Sword. I did everything but the cover art in that book. I did. So, Anyway, so I'm doing that again. And I would add, too, if you'll allow me to shamelessly plug, that anybody who's interested in signing up for the mailing list, you can just go to www.1942book.com. So the numerals 1942book.com, and sign up for my mailing list there. And I send out very infrequent updates. There will be no spam. So anyway, thanks.
Good
Yeah,
to know. Okay,
appreciate
that's
the
easy to
interest.
remember.
Yeah.
Hope everybody got that. Well, John, it's always great and enlightening and illuminating to talk with you. Thank you for joining us on here. It's always a
Appreciate the
pleasure.
time.
And again, we look forward to your next work, which is on its way out very soon.
Yep.
Can't get here soon enough, though.
All right.
All
Thanks
right.
for
Well,
having me.
yeah. Thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on here again sometime.
Sounds
That's
good.
it for us for today, folks. I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine. Please join us for the next installment, which will be very soon. Thank you.